I'm afraid that we are entering a new period in the global nuclear order. Maybe not quite yet, but I think the stability that we've experienced in the post-Cold War period is challenged by three factors that threaten to upset the global nuclear order, perhaps for decades. The first one I want to talk about is emerging technology, because this has received so much commentary. Technologies that might make nuclear forces less survivable or defenses against nuclear attack more effective, that threaten, in short, to upend the nuclear revolution by promising an escape from assured destruction and mutual vulnerability, but which could resurrect fears of surprise attack, surprise first strikes, that could lead to crisis instability and arms racing. As you may know, various analysts, including Keir Lieber, Darryl Press, Brendan Green, Austin Long, and others, have forecast a new era of counterforce and an end of assured destruction. And of course, they want the US to lead that technical revolution so as not to be vulnerable to nuclear coercion, and by the way, to secure bargaining advantages of the United States in a crisis with nuclear adversaries. I disagree that this new era of counterforce is likely to be upon us. I believe nuclear weapon states will be able to maintain survivable retaliatory forces capable of assured destruction. But I do worry that states will fear that their deterrent might become vulnerable and that they'll overreact to this in ways that will decrease stability. So my views on this are strongly influenced by a study that I participated in, led by Charlie Glazer, who was then at George Washington University. He's now at MIT. The study involved mostly physicists. So Jay Sankaran and I reviewed the various emerging technologies, including large constellations of space-based radars and other sensors for persistent observation, artificial intelligence for targeted identification and tracking, lethal autonomous vehicles, cyber weapons, hypersonic weapons, quantum sensors. Other members of the study group focused on the impact of these technologies on particular missions, like the survivability of mobile missiles and submarines. So Tom McDonald looked at mobile missiles, Tom Stefanik on submarine operations, James Acton looked at command and control, and Laura Grego examined missile defenses. And that study hasn't been published yet, but I thought I would share with you the top level conclusions is that nuclear weapon states should be able to maintain a survivable nuclear retaliatory force. And I think this is good news because that makes possible a stable deterrence with relatively small nuclear forces. Obviously, there isn't time for a complete review of all of those technologies, but I'll mention a few highlights. It's frequently postulated that space-based radars combined with machine learning could identify and track mobile ICBMs, bombers, mobile command posts, rendering those targets vulnerable to preemptive attack, perhaps even by conventional weapons rather than nuclear weapons. But it would be very difficult, I think impossible, to confidently achieve the extremely high level of performance needed to accurately discriminate the relatively small number of mobile nuclear targets, dozens or hundreds, from the tens and hundreds of millions of other objects that are on the ground and in the air. And adversaries can make that task a lot harder through the use of jamming, decoys, anti-simulation, and other techniques. Accurate algorithms require a very large and accurate training set, and adversaries can deny this or ensure that target signatures vary in an unpredictable manner. The usual answer to this is to use simulated data, but there are limits to what can be achieved because you can't anticipate everything an adversary might do. And an adversary can use its own algorithms to discover how best to evade identification and tracking. That's one of the discoveries of research in machine learning, is that algorithms or that countermeasures that work well against one algorithm work well against a broad range of algorithms that have been trained to do the same basic task, because they discover similar mechanisms for discrimination. Decoys can also be used to fool sensors and algorithms, but anti-simulation can be even more effective. Rather than make realistic decoys that mimic every signature of the actual mobile missile. You can make mobile missiles that look like a decoy. And my favorite example is what is the Soviet response in the mid-1980s when they worried that the United States might be able to track its mobile missiles. They designed a small ICBM and launcher that could fit inside what looked like a common commercial tractor trailer. From the air and space, even at high resolution, there was no observable difference between the mobile missile trailers and the hundreds of thousands of identical looking trailers that are on the highways and parked at facilities across the Soviet Union. And there are other ways to defeat this tracking at lower cost and at much lower cost than a constellation of space-based radars. Also been postulated that some combination of quantum sensors and autonomous sea or air vehicles could make the ocean transparent, making it possible to track ballistic missile submarines. But the practical range of quantum sensors, like quantum magnetometers, quantum gravimeters, is short, at best on the range of a few kilometers. And the ocean is a very, very big place. And the extreme sensitivity of quantum sensors makes them vulnerable not just to environmental noise, but also to jamming and decoys. With such a short range, continuous monitoring of possible trident patrol areas, which are enormous, would require millions of fixed sensors, or hundreds of thousands of underwater vehicles, or tens of thousands of UAVs, which is comparable to the number of ships and planes that are currently on the ocean. You might think of trailing a submarine, but that requires a platform with similar capabilities and endurance, basically a nuclear-powered submarine. And US and UK SSBNs have effective techniques to evade trailers, include transiting near large surface ships or releasing decoys. And it's also good to bear in mind that to be strategically significant, an adversary would have to not just track one or a few mobile missiles and submarines, would have to track all of them simultaneously and have the ability to destroy a large fraction of them. Nor do I believe that long-range hypersonic glide vehicles are a threat to strategic stability. David Wright and Cameron, blanking on Cameron's last name, have done a lot of great work on this. The time to target is not significantly shorter than for a ballistic reentry vehicle, especially one on a depressed trajectory, and both the launch and the trajectory of the hyperglide vehicle through the atmosphere are easily detectable. So there's really no technical basis for worries about some new surprise attack capability. And while we might be concerned about space-based radar, large constellations of small and inexpensive satellites in low Earth orbit can replace the small number of large and expensive satellites in high Earth orbits, making attack warning, communication, and navigation far more resilient to attack. And I'm even optimistic that nuclear command and control can be protected from both physical and cyber attack, and I could address that in questions if you're interested. Finally, an effective defense against ICBMs and SLBMs is likely to remain out of reach by virtue of both geography and physics. An effective defense requires that the missile or its warhead be intercepted either soon after launch, in the boost phase, in space during the mid-course phase, or in the atmosphere during the terminal phase. The boost phase intercept requires that the defense be close to the launch point. That's impossible for missiles launched deep within the United States, Russia, or China, or from submarines within an unknown location, a large patrol area. And the use of space-based lasers or interceptors for boost phase defense will remain just as infeasible and vulnerable to countermeasures as it was when it was evaluated in the days of SDI during the 1980s. Terminal defense requires defending every target of value, which could be in the hundreds or thousands, and can be overwhelmed by an offense that focuses its attacks on just a small subset of targets. And mid-course defense will remain vulnerable to decoys and anti-simulation. The use of artificial intelligence for discrimination will be limited by the same factors that I mentioned earlier. And all terminal and mid-course defenses will be vulnerable to perhaps the most effective countermeasure of all, nuclear explosions. This is relatively easy to implement with salvage fusing. When a warhead senses it's about to be destroyed by an interceptor, it detonates, and the nuclear explosion would blind sensors, both infrared and radar sensors, making tracking of subsequent warheads impossible. In fact, it was the inability to solve that problem that was a main factor in US decisions to abandon comprehensive missile defenses in the 1960s and then again in the 1980s. And that, again, I think this is all good news because survivable retaliatory forces that can penetrate defenses make possible a stable deterrence at relatively low force levels. But it's easy to imagine concerns about possible technological breakthroughs and any loss of confidence in the survivability or penetrability of nuclear forces could lead nuclear weapon states to greatly increase those forces. And in fact, that is what has happened in the past. We saw that in the 1960s. That's part of the reason why the US built a huge strategic arsenal, because it was worried about Soviet missile defense. And we can see it today in the responses of Russia and China to the deployment of very limited and ineffective missile defenses by the United States. The US tried very hard to convince Russia that its BMD systems had no capability against Russian strategic forces, and that we had no plans to provide such a capability, but we failed. We failed to convince Russia. And in fact, BMD, US ballistic missile defense, was cited by President Putin in his March 1918 speech when he unveiled all of the new nuclear systems as the key consideration for those new systems, like a big ICBM that could fly around the South Pole, a hyperglide vehicle, an intercontinental nuclear-powered torpedo, and most bizarrely of all, an intercontinental nuclear-powered air-launched cruise missile. And BMD may be the key factor in China's expansion of its nuclear arsenal. Now, again, I think these are overreactions because US missile defenses are limited and ineffective and vulnerable to countermeasures. But states do tend to err on the side of caution and assuming the worst, not only about our current, but about possible future capabilities and intentions is what states generally do. Aside from such overreactions, I think the main impact of emerging technology is likely to be indirect, that AI and autonomous systems supported by large constellations of satellites are certain to have a major impact on the conduct of conventional war. And that could have an impact on nuclear policy, as states that lead in such technologies may be able to reduce their reliance on nuclear weapons, but states that don't, that are vulnerable to advances in conventional warfare, may rely more on nuclear weapons. A final factor is sometimes cited as a challenge for the global nuclear order is the growth of nuclear power to combat climate change. I think forecasts of dramatic growth in nuclear power are overstated, although there's considerable enthusiasm in some quarters about a nuclear renaissance. And there are more than 60, the IAEA reports that more than 60 new reactor designs are under development. Most forecasts are for relatively modest growth, at most a doubling of nuclear electricity production by 2050, in which case nuclear would supply about the same percentage of world electricity supplies it does today, less than 10%. Almost all the growth in low carbon energy supply is likely to come from renewables, particularly solar or wind, combined with storage to compensate for the intermittency of those sources. And that's largely due to economics. The cost of solar and wind has been plummeting. Meanwhile, the cost of nuclear remains very high. And I see no indication that small modular reactors or other advanced designs are going to change that. And as long as those new reactors don't use high enriched uranium or plutonium, the main security concern will be the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology, which is the same concern today. So that's emerging technology, which I thought I would lead with because the center and Pugwash have been largely focused on the scientific and technical aspects of these problems. The second factor, though, is perhaps the main challenge to the global nuclear order is presented by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which poses both short-term risks and long-term challenges. The short-term risk, of course, is that Russia might actually use nuclear weapons. And I worry that we have become overconfident on that score, overconfident that Russia won't use nuclear weapons. I know many observers, like Laurie Friedman, have concluded that Russian nuclear saber rattling is an empty threat and a bluff that should be ignored. But I think there are good reasons to believe that nuclear use, I do think there are good reasons to believe that nuclear use is unlikely. Most especially that there really is no sensible, much less decisive military use for nuclear weapons in this conflict. And any use of nuclear weapons would further isolate Russia and make it even more of a pariah. Nevertheless, I don't think we can discount that possibility. Putin has shown no indication that he's willing to accept defeat. And so if Ukraine, as I hope, makes significant progress in recapturing territory in eastern Ukraine, and particularly if the Russian hold on Crimea appears to be in jeopardy, Putin might choose to use nuclear weapons in some desperate attempt to force a ceasefire and forestall defeat. And Putin himself cited Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a precedent, precisely for that, for forcing a surrender and an end to a war. Again, I don't think it's likely, but it is disturbing that some Russian analysts, who I otherwise consider to be thoughtful and knowledgeable people, have openly advocated for escalating nuclear threats and even for a nuclear attack against NATO. So as much as I hope that the Ukrainian counteroffensive succeeds, I do think success will bring with it the risk of nuclear use, and any use of nuclear weapons after almost 80 years of non-use would be a world-changing event. Exactly how is impossible to predict, and rather than spend more time on that, I am going to assume that we will avoid the use of nuclear weapons. But even then, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is likely to do severe and lasting damage to the global nuclear order, and I think we have to deal with those challenges. And first is where the immediate casualty is arms control. Russia has rejected US offers to resume inspections under the New START treaty. As you may know, Russia formally suspended its participation in New START, even though the treaty doesn't provide for a suspension. It's also rejected US offers to restart strategic stability talks and continue the arms control process, linking that agenda to the US abandoning its support for Ukraine. So I don't see those positions changing so long as the war in Ukraine continues. But even if the war should end and the arms control process is restarted, and any agreement with Russia is going to be very difficult given the many points of difference, which include missile defense, non-strategic forces, precision conventional strike. And it's even more difficult to see how any agreement that would be acceptable to Russia could be ratified by the US Senate. The expiration of New START in 2026 may mark the end of a nearly continuous 60-year-long process of nuclear arms control negotiations and binding treaties. And without the predictability and transparency provided by arms control treaties and the associated verification measures, we can expect worst-case assessments about future capabilities and intentions to flourish. Russian nuclear threats, combined with its large stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons, are also triggering a debate about whether the US and NATO nuclear forces are adequate to deter Russia, and whether NATO needs more types of non-strategic nuclear weapons. But the impact of the war goes well beyond this to threaten the foundation of the non-proliferation regime. Inasmuch as here you have a founding member of the United Nations, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is charged with ensuring international peace and security, waging a large-scale war of aggression and using nuclear threats to deter other countries from assisting the victim of its aggression. And even worse, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, gave up the nuclear weapons on its territory in 1993 in exchange for security assurances from Russia and from the United States and the United Kingdom that its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence would be respected, and that there would be no threat or use of force against Ukraine. So unless Russia withdraws completely from Ukraine, the war will have weakened the non-proliferation regime by demonstrating that a nuclear weapon state can ignore such security assurances and invade and occupy another country and use its nuclear arsenal to deter other countries from using force to oppose it. The wider impact of the war is blunted somewhat by the fact that Ukraine's not a member of NATO. The war does appear to have demonstrated the effectiveness of security guarantees of the United States, in as much as Russia has avoided attacks against NATO. And we might compensate for anything less than a complete withdrawal, Russian withdrawal, by admitting Ukraine to NATO, what's left of Ukraine, to deter future Russian attacks. But I think we can expect demands for reassurance to grow in South Korea, in Japan, and elsewhere, and increasing support for independent nuclear arsenals if those demands are not satisfied. So a third key challenge to the global nuclear order is the substantial and rapid expansion of nuclear forces by an increasingly aggressive China. This includes hundreds of road mobile and silo-based ICBMs and a new longer-ranged SLBM, all armed with multiple warheads. U.S. intelligence is projecting that China will deploy 1,000 strategic warheads by 2030 and 1,500, so parity with the U.S. and Russia by 2035. This might be a response, as I mentioned earlier, to missile defense, but I think it's the growing possibility of conflict over Taiwan that is key to the key consideration for China. Chinese analysts read the US literature. They know that US military analysts believe Taiwan is important to the defense of other allies in East Asia. And although China firmly believes that its interests in Taiwan are obviously larger and that they would prevail in a conflict, I think they worry that the US might use or threaten to use nuclear weapons rather than back down in a conflict over Taiwan. They've read the novel by James Stavridis, who was a former Supreme Commander of NATO, about a war over Taiwan that leads to the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States. They've read articles by Matt Kroenig and others arguing that nuclear superiority gives the state a bargaining advantage in a crisis, specifically in a crisis over Taiwan, and that the superior state can more credibly threaten nuclear escalation. And they know there was a debate within the US government about whether to acknowledge and accept mutual vulnerability with China. There was an opportunity to do that in the Obama administration, but wasn't done because of concerns by allies. And Chinese officials have often commented on this. So I suspect that's the main reason for the Chinese nuclear expansion, and that they believe that they're concerned that a minimum deterrent might not be adequate because the US might believe that it can credibly threaten nuclear escalation in a crisis over Taiwan. So it's clear that there are serious challenges to the existing nuclear order. This really is a critical moment, and I think the steps that we, the US and its allies, take in the next few years will determine whether we can get back onto the path of reducing nuclear risks or whether we're headed into a period of extended and increasing risk. I know that the US and the UK can't control the future, but there are things that we can do to increase the chances of a good outcome, and they mostly, for me, fall into the category of restraint. Don't overreact. While it can seem prudent to assume the worst and then begin to plan for it, that can quickly become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we don't know that restraint by the US will lead to restraint by Russia or China, but we can be certain that an overreaction by the US will lead to reactions by Russia and China. And we can already hear calls for overreaction. In response to the Chinese buildup, a number of former US officials have called for abandoning the New START limits and doubling deployed US strategic forces to 3,000 or 3,500. I think this is a prescription for a three-way arms race. Russia and China are likely to respond to a substantial increase in US forces by increasing their forces to ensure parity or restore parity. And an arms race would increase distrust and further damage relations, and that would increase the likelihood of crises. Now, fortunately, the US has so far resisted calls to expand its arsenal. I was glad to hear National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say that the US did not need to increase our nuclear forces to outnumber the combined total of our competitors. But I do think a substantial increase is likely because it will be driven by the longstanding preference in the United States for counterforce, the targeting of US nuclear forces against opposing nuclear forces in command and control, with the goal of limiting damage to the United States if deterrence fails. And with this strategy, all the additional Chinese missile silos and mobile missiles and command posts are going to generate requirements for additional deployed US strategic warheads. And while a stable parity might be possible with one nuclear peer with Russia, it just isn't possible with two peers if the US doubles its force so it can cover all of the Russian and Chinese forces. Russia and China are likely to conclude that they need even larger forces. So Charlie Glazer, James Acton, and I wrote an article about this in Foreign Affairs that was published recently. We note that the way out of this is to abandon counterforce and to deter Russia and China through the threat of assured destruction, a strategy that would largely decouple the size of the US force from that of our adversaries. We only need enough survivable nuclear weapons to ensure the destruction of our nuclear armed adversaries. And the current US force is more than adequate to do that. We also think that assured destruction is preferable because it decreases the likelihood of nuclear use and escalation, because counterforce generates concerns about preemption and the need to respond quickly before nuclear forces in command and control are destroyed. The most common critique of assured destruction is that it lacks credibility because it threatens an all or nothing response, but also that it's illegal and immoral because you're targeting civilians. Well, the first just simply isn't true. One can and should retain a spectrum of limited nuclear options, ranging from demonstration explosions to small attacks. The objections to the objections about the legality and morality of assured destruction, though, ring hollow when even advocates of counterforce acknowledge that counterforce attacks would result in massive civilian deaths and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. And in fact, that's not only unavoidable, but that it's an important component of deterrence. Charlie, James, and I believe the most moral nuclear strategy is one that minimizes the risks of nuclear war and escalation should war occur, not one that pretends to aim exclusively at military targets. So, because we're short on time, if you'd like more detail on this, please, I hope you'll read the Foreign Affairs article, but also an earlier article that Charlie and I wrote just on the issue of the law of armed conflict in Washington Quarterly. And just very quickly, we should also resist calls to deploy more non-strategic nuclear weapons in more locations or build more types. Does anyone believe Putin would have behaved any differently if NATO had twice as many tactical nuclear weapons, 10 times as many, or if they were deployed closer to Russia? And why would China be more deterred from invading or blockading Taiwan or attacking bases in Japan if the US had nuclear armed sea launched cruise missiles? I don't really see the connection. In fact, I think that's a lesson of the war in Ukraine, that nuclear weapons can't compensate for conventional weaknesses or for conventional problems. As Russia's discovered, nuclear threats are not an effective remedy for failures of conventional forces. If US allies can't be defended against conventional attack, the solution is to strengthen conventional defenses. So if Russia uses only one or a few tactical nuclear weapons, I hope the response is conventional. But if a nuclear response is decided, the existing force, in my view, is adequate. So I think it's incorrect to see non-strategic nuclear weapons as having a different or more important or more effective deterrent effect. And the final thing I think we should resist is the temptation to build up missile defenses. Here we can see this in the report of the Strategic Posture Committee that called for the development and fielding of homeland missile defenses that can deter and defeat attacks by Russia and China. So first, as I explained earlier, it's just not possible to do that, to deploy an effective missile defense against Russia and China. But we have been trying to persuade them that our missile defenses were not oriented against them. Announcing that our goal is now to prevent Russian and Chinese attacks is only going to validate the concerns they've been expressing all along. I do know that some people argue that if US missile defenses required Russia or China to launch 10 warheads against the US to ensure that just one or at least one would get through, that for that reason they'd be somehow less likely to engage in nuclear coercion. But I think this is deeply faulty logic, particularly given that the defense is likely to be ineffective. It's in our interest to limit nuclear attacks to the smallest extent possible, not give adversaries incentives to launch larger attacks. So now I realize that this presentation is a downer, so I thought I would try to end on a bit of a good note. And that is, one of perspective, going back again to the possibility of dramatic changes. And I remember how bleak the situation seemed in the mid-1980s, US and Soviet, in the early and mid-1980s. US-Soviet relations were absolutely terrible. The US was engaged in a proxy war in Afghanistan. A renewed nuclear arms race was in full swing. Reagan administration officials were talking about how a nuclear war could be fought and won, talking about with enough shovels, we'd all get through a nuclear war. The risk of nuclear war seemed very real then. And then Gorbachev came along and things changed dramatically in just a few years. Intermediate range nuclear weapons were eliminated, strategic weapons were cut in half, thousands of tactical nuclear weapons were removed, and Reagan and Gorbachev announced that a nuclear war could not be won and should never be fought. So I think the lesson is we have to be ready. We have to be ready when political progress is possible with Russia or China, even with Iran or North Korea, so that we can move forward quickly. And we have to be more flexible than we were in the past. Treaties take a long time to negotiate. We have to be prepared to enter into less formal agreements and political commitments, and to take unilateral actions that we hope will be reciprocated. And the most important thing that Americans can do is to reject Donald Trump. I know most of you will not be able to vote in that election, but at least you can join me in praying for the good health of Joe Biden. And with that, I will stop and welcome Chris's response.
Very good. Can I just check? Can you hear me from here? People online?
Everyone, I'm gonna assume yes. I'm gonna assume yes.
I can always move closer, so just let me know.
There are 2 questions.
Good. Brilliant. All right. So I want to start by thanking Steve for an excellent and wide-ranging talk, exploring some of today's most pressing nuclear risks, while debunking concerns around the impact of certain technologies, discussing the effect of the war in Ukraine, and also the impact of China's nuclear capabilities, and suggesting, at least some ways that might be difficult to achieve currently as to how these risks may be mitigated. I'm going to take this opportunity as respondent to dig a little deeper into some of these issues and push Steve on some of his points, stretching it also, if I may, the concept of nuclear risks to also include some non-nuclear weapons aspects. I'm going to start by going back to the war in Ukraine, but here I want to focus on the military action that has occurred in and around Ukraine's nuclear facilities, in particular the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine, which has been occupied now by Russian forces for more than a year. I think this is one of the unexpected aspects of the conflict, one of many, where few in the lead up to the invasion predicted that Russia would look to target Ukraine's nuclear facilities. While this is not the first time that nuclear facilities have been attacked, for example, reactors suspected of enabling nuclear weapons programs were destroyed in Iraq in 1981 and Syria in 2007, while cyber attacks have been used to steal sensitive nuclear information and cause physical damage to nuclear facilities. Most notably the Stuxnet attack at Iran's uranium enrichment facility in Natanz in the mid-2000s. However, I think it's fair to say that Russia's actions here are different in terms of motivation, the prolonged occupation of the plant, and the potential for radioactive release. So my question to Steve is, are we likely to see a nuclear disaster at the Zaporizhia, and what effects might that have locally and also on the potential nuclear renaissance that you mentioned? And more broadly going forward, what does this mean for how we think about nuclear security and the protection of nuclear facilities during future armed conflicts, as well as other types of crisis? How can we look to strengthen the international norms and legal foundations to protect these types of actions, and what might the IEA and others do to support this? We're going to move on to another topic as well. Lots of questions for you, Steve, at the end, if that's okay. So moving on, still sort of on the Ukraine war, but focusing on some of its more indirect impacts on nuclear risks. And in particular, I wanted to push Steve a little more on the points he made regarding the nuclear arms race between the sort of US, Russia, and China, and in particular his recommendation that the US limits its nuclear forces in terms of both numbers and types of missions. You know, while there is a logic to the US taking these actions, I think others would say that there is a fundamental tension that needs to be carefully addressed when reducing the role of US nuclear weapons, but also keeping US alliances strong. And here I think particularly of the Indo-Pacific and the US's extended deterrence commitments to Japan and South Korea. So how to maintain the credibility of extended deterrence? You know, this is not a new issue, of course, but I think the war in Ukraine has made this more difficult, with policymakers in Japan and South Korea expressing concerns about Russia's repeated nuclear threats, and whether this is something that might be adopted in the future by their nuclear-armed adversaries, namely China and North Korea, and whether this could lead to more assertive actions on their part. Earlier in the year, the Japanese Prime Minister warned that Ukraine today may be Asia tomorrow. So my question to Steve is, how can the US reassure Japan and South Korea of the credibility of extended deterrence commitment while limiting its nuclear options? Or should extended deterrence also include the threat of limited nuclear use and potentially forward deployment? And finally, you know, what is the risk now? This has waxed and waned over the years that Japan and South Korea might look to develop their own nuclear weapons capability. For my final remark, I just want to come back to the nuclear power renaissance that Steve briefly mentioned, noting its potential for modest growth and outlining how the main security risks stem from the potential use of highly enriched uranium or plutonium and the spread of associated uranium enrichment and reprocessing technologies. I'd agree with this, but I add that I think it's also worth considering the potential risk posed by dozens of novel advanced reactor designs currently on the drawing board that are set to be deployed and operated over the next couple of decades. The potential economic and other benefits of these reactors are often talked about. For example, road mobile and floating nuclear power plants that can be transported to areas of need. But the flexible deployment of these microreactors with small plant footprints, as well as the use and development of novel advanced fuels, may also pose a set of security challenges. So my question there to Steve is, should we be concerned about these new set of technologies, and how might we look to mitigate any future risks? And then that's Steve, lots of questions. So
well, thanks,
yeah,
Bruce.
over to you.
Why don't I take the nuclear power questions first? I first just think the Russian behavior in both, not just Zaporizhia, but Chernobyl earlier, just was shocking and just so reckless and appalling. I don't follow the situation at Zaporizhia closely. I understand it is under Russian control. The site is under Russian control. But that all of the reactors have been shut down for quite some time, that wells have been drilled to provide cooling water after the blowing up of the dam, and that Russia is allowing diesel fuel to be delivered for the emergency diesel generators at the site, so that the situation is stable now, although I don't really know how to assess the longer term risk of a nuclear disaster there, because I think it would depend on the scenario, whether Ukrainian troops try to retake the site or surround the site. And if they do, what Russian forces would do in response. Would they sabotage the site? I mean, I hope that Russia would understand that Russians and Russian territory is at risk of contamination in the event of an accident. I think the effect of an accident on the future of nuclear power would depend on the scenario. the cause of the accident and the consequences. It's possible, I think even likely, because the reactors have been shut down for so long, that any release would be contained within the containment structure as it was, in 3 Mile Island, even if there's core damage. But obviously, deliberate Russian sabotage could lead to a large release. And I do think, though, it is unrealistic to expect that civilian facilities can be protected from war, especially from deliberate attack. That's just too much to ask of any facility. But it isn't unique to nuclear reactors. I mean, it applies to hydroelectric dams, as we saw in Ukraine. It applies to natural gas storage. It applies to chemical plants. What I think that Zaporizhzhia shows, though, is that agreements not to attack these facilities are only as good as the commitments of states to abide by those agreements. And so I know that there are calls to strengthen protections, to strengthen agreements, but I'm not sure how much that can really protect future reactors. And then, turning to what this also then means for new reactors, even though there are 60 designs that are under development, I don't think that we have to worry about 60 or even a few dozen of those designs being deployed. The process of fully developing and licensing and deploying a reactor, that process is very demanding and expensive. So I expect that this will shake out quickly to a few designs that have the potential for widespread deployment. And 1 or 2 of those might be mobile, but the safety and security implications would depend on the details. Some of these mobile reactors are microreactors of low power, less than 5 megawatts, very low power density, low enough that they are cooled entirely passively with heat pipes, no pumps, even in normal operation, full power operation. The designs I've examined use high assay LEU, 20% enriched LEU for the fuel, and therefore have a long core lifetime, up to 15 years. And so the reactor could be delivered as a sealed unit, operate for 15 years, and then returned to the supplier at the end of the life. So I think a reactor like that could be very safe and secure, even if it's deployed in many locations, and even protected from attack if it's placed underground. On the other hand, a floating Russian reactor, say a floating lead-cooled Russian fast reactor, even a pressurized water reactor of the type that was on the Kursk reactor, that is moored near a major city, that could obviously be a disaster waiting to happen. So I think it depends on the details. As regards extended deterrence, I think we have to distinguish between 2 kinds of extended deterrence: using US nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attack on US allies, and using US nuclear weapons to deter other kinds of attack, conventional and other non-nuclear attack. I think the first, deterring nuclear attack, is fairly straightforward and doesn't depend very much on the type or location of the nuclear weapons, the US nuclear weapons that are doing the deterrence. And of course, we do have bombs that are stationed in several NATO countries for delivery by dual capable aircraft. And I think that's a credible deterrent to respond to a limited Russian attack with tactical nuclear weapons. But I think it's important to bear in mind that those US weapons that are in Europe are under the control of the US president. And if a US president is considering the use of those weapons, a US president is going to see it as an attack by the United States on, for example, Russia, because that's how Russia is going to see it. And the same applies to tactical weapons in Asia. Should we deploy them there? Well, once again, China will see it as a US attack on China, regardless of where the weapons are based. So I really don't think that more or additional types of non-strategic nuclear weapons are needed to deter the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons by Russia or China. We already have various low-yield options: bombs, air-launched cruise missiles, even now a low-yield Trident warhead. it all comes down to the perceived credibility of US threats to actually use those weapons in retaliation to a Russian or a Chinese nuclear attack against our allies. And actually, I don't think we have to worry too much about Chinese first use of nuclear weapons. I think they take their no first use commitment seriously. Now, turning to the use of US nuclear weapons to deter non-nuclear attacks against our allies, I think that's much more difficult. And here I think we have to realize and accept that nuclear weapons are not a solution to conventional shortcomings and weaknesses. I think Russia's finding that out in Ukraine. In order for nuclear weapons to be an effective deterrent to a conventional attack, you have to have credible operational plans to use nuclear weapons. And I have asked my South Korean and my Japanese colleagues on many occasions for a scenario in which they believe it would be in the interest of South Korea or Japan, or for that matter, the United States, to initiate the use of nuclear weapons in their defense, to basically start a nuclear war with Russia or with China or with North Korea in their defense on their behalf. And I have yet to hear a plausible scenario in which they want us to start a nuclear war, because they understand that they would be the first victims of nuclear retaliation. And if there's no plausible scenario for the actual use of nuclear weapons, then nuclear weapons can't be a credible deterrent. And so I think it's much better in those scenarios to focus on on defending against non-nuclear attacks with non-nuclear forces. And I think that's possible for South Korea and Japan. I think that's possible today. And I think it's even possible for Taiwan. And with that, I'll stop, and I hope there's time for some.
We absolutely do. We have 20 minutes for questions. We've just had two short questions come in through the chat function.
Yes.
I believe the first question was from Jan. Jan, if you would like to, so Jan's question is there any meaningful military role for new US nuclear weapons in Europe, like the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, etc.? And we have a second question from Navidad regarding detonation of a nuclear weapon in space. So if you would like to take Jan's question first, and then maybe
Sure.
Okay.
Marion's coming.
Well, fortunately, I think I just answered John's question. In fact, I saw that question in advance and realized that it would sort of overlap with Chris's question. And basically, no, I really don't think that there's any need for new types of nuclear weapons that would be based in Europe, additional nuclear weapons based in Europe. I think that we can deter Russian nuclear use effectively with the weapons that we already have. And then turning to the second question, I think this maybe refers to salvage fusing, which is kind of an obscure concept, but this was actually invented a long time ago, or conceived of in the 1960s, when the US was trying to develop missile defenses that used nuclear interceptors. In fact, that's what the Soviet Union did, right? The Soviet defenses are armed with nuclear interceptors, and we were looking at ways to defeat the Soviet defense. I'm sure the Soviet Union, we were looking at possible countermeasures that the Soviet Union might use to defeat our defense, and one of those were called, precursor nuclear bursts. You detonate a nuclear weapon, and then that would blind the defense. It would make radar tracking and infrared tracking impossible. And then it was realized, well, you don't even have to use dedicated nuclear precursor bursts. You can simply equip your warhead with sensors so that if it senses that it's about to be destroyed, it detonates first. And it doesn't take long to detonate a nuclear weapon. It takes microseconds. And so in fact, that we cannot ensure, even if we had an interceptor that we would be sure could hit a Russian or Chinese warhead, we cannot prevent the detonation, a nuclear detonation of that warhead. And maybe even the North Koreans are clever enough to figure that out. Now, You might say, well, that's good because the nuclear explosion occurred in space or it occurred high in the atmosphere. It didn't occur on the ground, and that is true. The problem is that nuclear explosion then blinds the defense. And in fact, you can still find materials from the 1960s on YouTube that show what happens to the radar track of a radar when it tries to look through the cloud of ionized particles that's generated by a nuclear explosion. Basically, the radar track just goes all over the place and you can't track the income. And if you can't track incoming warheads, you can't intercept.
There's a new one right at the end, Miriam posted.
Okay, for the sake of our audience here in person, I'll just read out the question. While the idea of a Ukrainian nuclear deterrent was unthinkable, given the historical, political context, geographic location, technical and financial deficits and future risks, and furthermore, Ukraine's prospective NATO membership seem remote, what, in your opinion, might serve as a sustainable assurance of Ukraine's national security over the long term? And then there's a little bit of follow-up as well. To what extent does that strategy rely on heavily on Ukraine, akin to Israel, Marianne suggests, and considering that it doesn't address the prevention of conflicts in the first place? So, an interesting question there.
Okay.
Yeah, there.
So I know it will seem like to some a long shot, but I do think that the best way of securing Ukraine's security, maybe the only way of confidently ensuring Ukraine's security over the long term, should this war end or there be a ceasefire, is by admitting Ukraine to NATO. I'm not sure if that will be politically feasible because, you know, all 28 countries, or now, are there 28 or now there's 30? I've lost track of how many NATO countries there are now that Finland and Sweden have joined. But if that's not possible, then security guarantees by a subset of countries like the United States, the US, and France to start with, perhaps some others like Germany could also be effective in making it clear to Russia that should Russia ever attack again, we would be involved, on that our forces would engage directly in the conflict. I think the war has shown that those security guarantees can be effective. I'm sure that Russia would love to be able to attack bases in Poland that are being used to supply Ukraine with weapons, but it has been deterred from doing so by the security assurances in NATO. So really, I think that's that combined with a much more effective and robust defense. So Ukraine now, everyone is observing, has the largest army in Europe, and that may have to be a permanent feature even after a war ends, to make the adoption also of what people are calling in the Taiwan case a porcupine strategy. Just make it mount a defense that simply makes invasion and conquest incredibly painful for any aggressor, but particularly for Russia.
If we have any questions from anyone in the room, please, Paul, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
I'm Paul Shaw. I used to be Director of Arms Control and Proliferation in a small but perfectly formed nuclear power. So, and I'm now actually here. The question, I mean, I hope we get to talk later offline on this, but it's a general question about the way that the current nuclear and military situation is such a complete collapse of expectations about the nuclear future, such a crashing of what we were told the inevitable, righteous, necessary advance of multilateral treaties solidifying more and more security under strict and effective international control. That is such an unbelievable future now that a fundamental rethinking is going to be necessary. And my feeling is that this is going on within governments, privately, because it's such an ugly thing that particularly foreign ministries don't want to admit it, but defense ministries are thinking very hard. But generally, the academic studies community hasn't wanted to face up to this. They haven't wanted to think the unthinkable, which for them is not nuclear apocalypse, but the end of the NPT bargain and all the formula we've all used for years. So we are in a void of useful thinking, at least publicly useful thinking, about how we move forward into a believable and slightly better nuclear future. I mean, is that how you diagnose the present situation? Or am I being too cruel?
No, I don't think you are. I think you may have come after my opening remarks where I basically said it is a very bleak situation with regard to nuclear risks. Wherever you look, they seem to be increasing. It is very hard to see a source of optimism. And I think at least for the near term, I am going to focus my efforts on preventing it from getting dramatically worse in the short term by, as I said, focusing on trying to prevent a gross overreaction. So I don't think that, as many of my current and former colleagues believe, I don't think it's necessary for the US to double the size of its deployed strategic nuclear forces in response to the growth of the Chinese nuclear arsenal. But that's going to require a lot of, I think it's going to require a reconsideration of some basic US thinking and policy, how we think about how to deter Russia and China. I'm not confident that that will occur. I also see that there are calls in many quarters for a rather dramatic expansion of non-strategic nuclear forces, of tactical nuclear forces, of new systems, not just the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. Again, I don't think that's necessary for very good reasons. I don't think that that is needed for deterrence. So what I'm hoping we could end similarly with missile defense. There are calls already to greatly thickened, bolstered missile defenses so that we can now defeat a Russian or a Chinese attack. I think that is mistaken for basic technical reasons. I don't think it's possible. So at least I hope we can hold the line or maybe prevent a gross overreaction in the near term, that maybe that's the best that we can hope for. And then, of course, in the longer term, we can hope for a change in the political relationships. Mr. Putin is not going to live forever. I'm not sure that what will come immediately after him will be much better, but I think, the mid-1980s was an example, or the late 1980s was an example of the possibility of a dramatic change in political relationships that made possible reductions in nuclear forces and nuclear risks. And so I think that's probably the best that we can hope for. We can hope that that opening will eventually, if we are patient, come about both with Russia and eventually with China.
But hope is not a strategy.
Hope is not a strategy. So in the meantime, I want to prevent a gross overreaction, which of course won't end with the United States. There was a wonderful book written by Herb York called Race to Oblivion. I think it was written in the early 1970s. And he talked about the fallacy of the last move, how this was often a pattern in US decision-making, that the United States would decide to do something, like to deploy 1,000 ICBMs or a missile defense. And we would make the fallacy of the last move. We believe that would be the end of the story, that we would do this and then that would deal with the threat. But of course, we don't get to make the last move. All of our adversaries get to respond. And we have to anticipate those responses. And to me, it's just shocking that the people who are advocating a doubling of the US nuclear arsenal, they do not address what Russia and China will do in response to this. And in fact, just in an email exchange with one of these people, with a former Bush administration official, he said, "Oh, you're exaggerating the risk of an arms race." Well, why am I exaggerating? Why will Russia and China not respond to a doubling of our nuclear arsenal with a doubling of their nuclear arsenal, when everything we know about the history of the nuclear age points in that direction. So I hope we can get people to think about that and realize that actually an overreaction, a lack of restraint will not be in our security, not be in our long-term security interest.
We're just coming up on time. We have 5 minutes remaining, so I think we should be able to fit 2 more questions in. This question from Gus. Hi, Steve. Can you comment on the possible influence on the final report of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the US in terms of procurement of new weapons? And we have another question coming from John Draper. And their question was about assessments of AI. Let me just bring up John's question 1 second. John's question was, Russian political scientists are scenario building that the route towards artificial general intelligence will worsen the risk of nuclear war with Russia and China as part of a technology supremacy endgame. Do you share that view?
Okay, well, the second question is easy. I don't believe artificial general intelligence is something we have to worry about in my lifetime, since I'm 64 years old. I don't think I'm going to live to see that. Gus's question, I think the report of the Strategic Posture Commission is a little better than I feared it might be. It did not call explicitly for a major increase in deployed in US nuclear forces, although you will notice that in the preface, the chair says, well, we wanted this to be a consensus report, and so we didn't call for that, but many of the commissioners believe that it was inevitable, that they'd be and I do believe it is inevitable. And also, the report called for, it didn't say more non-strategic nuclear weapons and more types, but it basically did in saying that we had to address this need. And then, as I mentioned, it did call for missile defenses that would be effective against Russia and China, which I think is a big step backwards, given that in order to limit, in order to make possible future reductions, or at least make possible future arms control agreements with Russia and China, we've been trying to persuade them that our missile defenses are not oriented against them. So if we take the recommendation of this report, I think seriously on missile defense, it would just make it impossible to reach any agreements with Russia or China on limitations on offensive forces. So I do think the report is likely to be influential given who's on it, but maybe not with the current administration, perhaps with the next, which I hope will be a second Biden administration, but there will be another nuclear posture review, and that will be a very different nuclear posture review from the last one, the last 3 or 4, because it will have to deal with this new reality. And in particular, if we're not going to change our nuclear employment doctrine, basically counterforce, I think it's inevitable that there would be a major increase in nuclear force. And it'd be very difficult to persuade US Strategic Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to change their basic strategy, their basic nuclear strategy for how they think about deterring nuclear war, which again is really founded on counterforce. So with that, it's
3:30. So thank you everybody who has joined us online and here in KCL for today's session. I'd like to extend again warm thank you to Steve for joining us and for a really enlightening presentation. Thank you as well, Chris, for your response. And I hope today was a useful session for considering the major crises that are occurring in the nuclear order and for the potential emerging technology risks that people are thinking about here in KCL and as well in the US. So thank you again to everybody who's joined us, and I hope you'll join us again for sessions in the future. And thanks again to British Pugwash. So, thank you.
Thank you.